Hello everyone, it's Dr. Paul Rose back with another example of best practice for doing an MSc. And today we're going to be looking at how to do a critical review. That is, how do we take a published piece of work, read it, digest it, and consider its contents, the good points, the challenges, the opportunities, and the limitations that we can take out of the original piece of work that allows us to extend our thoughts and evaluation of its contribution to the scientific literature. So what is a critical review? A critical review is where you choose a paper, or perhaps you're given a paper as part of an assignment, and you have to summarize the original study, you have to set it into context, and you have to explain how it's advanced our understanding of that area of science. A critical evaluation doesn't mean you're critical of what the authors have done. It means you are considered objective and unbiased in your review of the paper. Yes, you can point out challenges. Yes, you can identify limitations, but you're not criticizing what has been done. You're critiquing and reviewing how this paper adds to the wider body of literature. So remember, no personal opinions, no unbiased or sweeping statements, no colloquialisms. Be balanced, valid, and ethical in how you explain the good and the less good parts of your paper. You need to make sure that you set the study in the context of the wider literature. Whilst your piece of work might be focusing on one chosen paper, you still need to go and read other papers, because this wide coverage of the literature allows you to see the precedent that has gone before the article that you have, and then the follow-on, the potential other areas of science that your paper fits into. Please remember, for any form of critical review, or indeed for any part of your scientific writing where you take outside examples and use them to support your arguments, it's always best to find original primary research papers. These original research papers are much better than review articles, which are simply someone else's opinion, unpublished internet sources, which are not necessarily critiqued and reviewed, and textbooks, which can go out of date very quickly. When we're critiquing primary literature, it's best to do that critique alongside of other pieces of primary literature. So you should start off by reviewing, explaining, and discussing the study that you have. Think about what the authors did, how they collected data, and what they concluded. This will demonstrate your understanding of the original methods, the results that were gleaned, and the conclusions that have been drawn from these results. So start off with an explanation of the original research before you start extending your arguments by using other examples. If you're aiming for top marks or top grades in any form of critical review piece, and hopefully everybody that's watching this video is, think about the originality of your thoughts, as well as how relevant they are and how logical you develop your flow or arguments. So for any form of critical review, you must provide original evaluation of the original study. So this is critique of the study's design, the experimental setup that was used, the observational schedule. It was a review of the general methodological approach, what was done and why, and this allows you to determine the validity of the original conclusions. Remember, the key thing about the scientific method is that we ask questions, we generate data, we draw conclusions, and then we ask more questions. And this should be replicated so others can take the original method and do it themselves. Keep this in the back of your mind when you're doing a critical review. Examine the rationale for the study. Is it relevant? Is it viable? Are the aims going to fill a gap in the literature? What's the point of the authors conducting this experiment? What are they hoping to achieve in the first place? Is there actually a problem or challenge that is true and generically out there that can be filled by this piece of research? Or is it perhaps really far-fetched and not likely to fulfill its aims? So think about the positive and negative aspects of the paper. What's good about it and what's not so good about it, particularly focused on the experimental design and the validity of the results and the conclusions. When you're reading the methods, you should then identify areas of improvement, particularly around follow-up studies that allow you to address any limitations. So what could be extended? What other pieces of research could be done that allows you to iron out any flaws or weaknesses in the original study and therefore make future contributions to the literature even stronger? So let's take a piece of published research and think about how we would do a critical review. So I'm being a little bit flippant in this example because it's something that appeared on Twitter that I just thought was brilliant. It's a poster, a mocked up conference poster from a mental disorders research centre in Norway. But it's actually looking at research into the pet cat of one of the authors. And the study was investigating where the cat went, the behaviours that the cat performed, and the likelihood of environmental or climatic influences affecting the cat's behaviour. So if this was our study, how would we go about doing a critical review? Well, we'd start off by explaining to the reader what has been found out. What was investigated? What subject was used? What's the background to the study? So we can explain the sample size, we can explain the case study nature of the piece of research. We can talk about the question, why was this research project instigated in the first place? That's our scene setting that tells the reader about the piece of work that we are critiquing. We then move on and think about the methods. Are they well described? Are they appropriate for the results? Do they allow the researchers to collect data that allows them to do the right types of analysis that support the results that are presented? And most importantly, could the study be repeated? We're then looking at the results themselves. What was gleaned from these results? Are they actually a true reflection of how the methods have been implemented? And therefore, if they are valid and appropriate, what do they add to the wider body of subject knowledge? So in this example, we've got a case study on a particular cat. How the cat was followed around is explained in text and visually by a diagrammatic heat map, if you like, of where the cat went on different days of the study. We've got differences in, or no difference, as has been found, in the day or month or time of the year that the cat was active. We have got a nice correlation between environmental temperature and the cat's behaviour, how far he travelled each day. And then at the bottom, we've got a nice explanation of the change in activity pattern over a longitudinal period. So the methods are explained, the case study is outlined, an illustration of how the animal's movements were assessed is provided, and we've got some interesting results. So we can take all of this information, think about what other authors have done, what other papers have been published on cat behaviour, and we can use the wider body of research to think about where could this study go in the future, what has been learned about cat behaviour, how useful is it, is the case study approach good, could we add a wider sample size? All of these things that might allow us to judge, evaluate and analyse the relevance of these results and therefore the importance of the study. It's important that your critical review tries to synthesise something new about the research that you've read. So where could it go? How could it be extended? how could you iron out any limitations by your wider reading of the background literature? So now I'm going to go through each section of a critical review to give you some pointers and ideas on what to follow. So your starting point, as I've mentioned, is your explanation of the paper that you have. In your introductory paragraphs, so try and use about a fifth of your word count for this. Explain your study, explain the paper that you've read, what it's found, its aims, its methods, its definitions and approaches to the scientific question. Provide a succinct and concise explanation and discussion of the paper that you have read, so that when you build your arguments in the main body of your report, the reader can see exactly the starting point. The reader can understand the precise aim and objective of the piece of primary research that you originally read. Once you've explained the piece of work that is the basis of the critical review, the main body of your report, and I would use about 3/5 of your word count for this, should set out your arguments, your positives, your challenges, your opportunities for research extensions, identified limitations. You should reference widely. You should use other papers to support your research extensions. And you should also use other papers to explain appropriate methods or other approaches that could allow you to extend the study. You must add context. You must explain where your original paper sits within the wider body of literature. And please remember, it's very easy to think about limitations and challenges within experimental design. We are very good as human beings at picking flaws. But remember, a critical review is not to criticize. A critical review is to be unbiased and objective. So what are the positive elements of the research? Have a balanced argument between what is novel and added to the literature, as well as what can be extended. Think about how the study builds on precedent. Think about what it adds to the body of existing knowledge, and therefore the aims of the original study. What do we now know once this study has been published that we didn't know before it existed? And finally, you must remember your conclusions. Conclude again with around 1/5 of your word limit. Be succinct and concise. Avoid new information. Avoid novel references. Simply summarize your key thoughts and ideas. Bring together all you've evaluated and critiqued, and round off your critical review so the reader can see this is your most important take-home message, and this is why that take-home message is important. Never simply end a critical review without a conclusion. The reader really needs to see you wrapping up your review so it crystallizes your key thoughts and ideas. A common question that is asked by research students when we do critical evaluation or critical analysis is how many references do I use? And the number of references is entirely up to you. Too many citations per sentence or point in your work can mean you're too verbose. You're using too many citations for the sake of it, and you're not evaluating each one. A huge list of citations against one particular point or sentence is not going to allow the reader to see which are the most important examples from the literature. If you are using 6, 7, 8 citations, then you're best to then explain and evaluate each of them, because clearly if you've chosen that many citations, that big number of citations is obviously important to your argument, so it's best to then explain each. However, if you use too few citations, you show insufficient coverage of the literature. You're not citing thoroughly and fluently, and that can be poor academic practice. It is essential that you cite every time you take information from the published literature to give credit to the original authors of that research. And you can then build your explanation of those citations you can compare and contrast them, and therefore you create a fluid, a narrative to your critical review that provides the reader with opportunities to engage with your wider reading. Please remember, the best way to get fluid and objective in how you use examples and how to know how many references to use is to read widely. The best way to judge the quality of the academic literature is to read as many papers as possible to keep up to date with developments in your field, and therefore, by reading other scientific papers, you can see how those authors have used citations to support their arguments, and you can mirror good practice. How many citations are generally used in the papers within your field? That is your baseline for the number of papers that you should use to support your arguments in similar pieces of work, in similar types of essays or reports. I've just mocked up two examples here, completely fictitious. An example of good academic practice and an example of poorer academic practice. So what we can see here with the green tick is the example of the good academic practice. We have used references consistently within the paragraph. We've attempted to show a wide coverage of the literature, but we've not used a whole string of citations to support one point. We've explained to the reader precisely where that fact or point of view can be found. At the end of the paragraph, we've brought together what these references mean in some novel evaluation. Simply stating a point from a published paper and using a reference is very descriptive. It's not going to give the reader any clues as to your own evaluation. So please remember, cite your material, compare and contrast published sources, but then bring that together at the end with your own evaluation and your own thoughts on why these references matter. With the red cross, we can see an example of poorer academic practice. The paragraph has very weak referencing. The referencing is not consistent, and there's many sweeping statements that are not supported. We then have a whole list of references that are vaguely attached to a sentence, but we don't know which key point or argument is related to which citation. The citations are not embedded fluently throughout the paragraph. And then at the end of the paragraph, we have a statement which we don't know whether or not that's evaluation on the part of the author, or if this is another point taken from the academic literature that hasn't been cited. So this poorer academic practice hasn't used references consistently. It has a large number of citations attached to one part of the paragraph, yet the reader doesn't know which citation relates to which argument. So base your critique, base your critical evaluation on the paragraph with the green tick, and avoid doing things like the paragraph with the red cross. So my summary for this short explanation of how to do a critical review. Read the original paper that is the basis of your critique and digest its contents. Perhaps you highlight important areas of the research or the methods used with a highlighter pen or some of the highlighter features on Adobe, for example. But make sure you yourself are familiar with what the paper shows before you try and explain that to others. Read the reference list of this original paper. What papers have they cited? Look up these papers to understand the context of the research. Read the papers in the introduction of your paper, because that will provide the scene setting for why the aims matter. And then read the papers that they have cited in the methods to show the precedent for their experimental design. And then finally, go away and read the papers that they use in their discussion, so you can see how they've attempted to put their results into the wider body of literature. It is not plagiarism to cite the sources that the original paper has used in your own research, so long as you cite them correctly and so long as you're not simply plagiarizing the original arguments. Add novelty, add synthesis, and add critical evaluation of your arguments. If you want to find the broader body of literature to see where your original paper fits, then simply do a Google Scholar or similar, perhaps Web of Science or Science Direct, of the title or subject area. Take the key words that you can find under the abstract, and when you've done your Google Scholar search, see what other literature is out there. Are you finding new papers that have existed since the paper that you have has been published? Or have you found new papers that your paper hasn't originally cited? By taking keywords, by taking the title of your paper and Google Scholar searching, you add more context by finding more novel papers that you can include in your critical review. I hope this has been useful and has explained what a critical review is, that being critical is not criticism, it's objective, it's unbiased, and it's putting the original paper in context. Good luck with your research work, and thank you very much for listening.